thank you, and Jason, welcome to class, and I'll turn it over to you.
So my name is Jason Bergtold. I'm an associate professor in ag economics, or kind of that other science. Anyone here actually social science background? Yeah. What I'm going to present today is crop production and conservation, some of the research that I've done in my career over the last decade, and try to touch Kansas as much as I can in terms of, and give you some of the latest and greatest that we've been doing in terms of looking at farming in Kansas. And then kind of open up for questions at the end. So I hope not to go the full fifth. The other thing I will say is if you have questions as we go, because I bring up something you guys don't know what I'm talking about, feel free to raise your hand and ask. That's not a problem. So you can treat this like a regular class instead of a seminar. And so in terms of my background, just so you guys kind of have some background where I come from, I graduated at Virginia Tech in ag economics, went on to Auburn University working with USDA Agricultural Research Service at the National Soil Dynamics Lab, where I did work on heavy residue conservation systems, so looking at crop production, and then spent 3.5 years there and then came to Kansas State. So I've been here for 7 years. And I pretty much do a lot of research initially on conservation, got into bioenergy as it got bigger. So I've spent a few years looking at bioenergy production, mostly at farm level, and supply of feedstocks and kind of farmers' willingness to grow feedstocks and marketing. And then more recently we're looking at land use change. So we're trying to take a more holistic view, looking at the agricultural landscape, and then getting into more large-scale human natural systems integrated modeling. And so that's kind of been my path. And so I'm kind of targeting a new path. Keeps conservation in there, but it keeps adding everything I've learned up to this point. So it keeps getting more complicated, more interesting, because I'm actually working with more natural scientists the more and more research I do. And so kind of as a basic outline, I'll introduce what I consider conservation cropping systems, or kind of an overview, talk about the economics of conservation adoption, looking at benefits and costs, and then touch on intensification, policy, and risk. Okay? So this is kind of give you guys an overview and a look at some of the issues surrounding from the economic perspective or the socioeconomic perspective. So conservation cropping production systems. And so these are very dynamic systems in terms of we're looking at crop production, growing crops all across the United States, and conservation changes from region to region. So it's very region specific on what works, what you do, and what you need to do. Even in Kansas, as you go east to west, north to south, the crop production systems change. And so what we incorporate into an actual, what I would call a conservation crop production system is going to differ from region to region, okay? But there's usually some primary elements that carry across. One is an area I kind of specify as cover crop and residue management. That's the management of crop residues that are left on the soil surface like a mulch. And they drastically change from, this is a picture from the southeast of a rye cover crop that has grown about 8 to 10 feet tall that's being rolled and left as a mulch on the soil surface. So there's about 10,000 pounds or 5 tons of residue left as a mulch versus more kind of less residue left here in Kansas. We tend not to be able to produce as much. But the whole point of keeping that residue on the soil surface to retain water in the soil, help prevent soil erosion, and improve soil productivity. In addition to this, that's coupled directly with this is conservation tillage and cash crop management. Something I don't think some people don't always think about holistically in the sense, and the reason I tend to look at it more of a system perspective now is because when you adopt conservation tillage, you adopt any type of residue management schemes, you end up not only adding those practices to your system, you have to change how you manage the whole system. One thing I learned when I was down in Alabama was that when you start adopting conservation tillage, you start putting these cover crops in, the pests that you deal with change. The disease and the pests actually change. And so you're changing your whole regime of pesticides, herbicides that you were using in a conventional system when you go to the conservation system. So management changes. Timing of stuff changes. There are benefits and costs. And so conservation tillage is the general tillage of reducing tillage, no longer using moldboard plows, kind of moving away from discs, chisels, kind of moving mostly toward no-till, which is probably the dominant form of tillage, which is not doing any invasive tillage, or just doing what we call deep tillage, which sometimes we call in-row subsoiling. And so that's just really breaking up below the surface, and it's breaking up hard pans. Okay, so roots can get down into deeper into the soil. And so there's this whole aspect of just the management of the crop itself we got to take into consideration. And then there's, I mentioned that the pests change. One of the improvements, hopefully, from adopting conservation is better fertilization, better nutrient cycling. And so taking that into account and building in options in here that can actually enhance the aspects of nutrient and pest management when managing crops. And so all of these integrate into each other. So it's not like just conservation tillage is right here. Well, that residue management is directly involved in conservation tillage because conservation tillage is defined as leaving 30% of your crop residue on the soil surface. In addition, conservation tillage is what changes your pest and nutrient dynamics. And so you got to take that into account in management. And so what's interesting, though, is when talking to people, people learn this over time. It's not something you just adopt and they go, oh, it's changed. It's something that you learn. It's a learning process, okay? So there's a curve to adoption, and we'll get to that here in a little bit. So some of the practices that are involved. Give you guys some idea. I didn't know exactly background, so give you some idea. No tillage is the predominant practice now. I'd say this is actually probably the conventional practice overall. It's the most commonly used. It's also called direct seeding or zero tillage. There's different names. It is a form of conservation tillage. And in essence, this is the absence of tillage or cultivation of the soil prior to planting and during management of the cash crop. So we're not actually going in with a cultivator to deal with weed management either. And so we're not turning over the soil. We're leaving it. Just same reason when you guys put mulch outside in your flower garden, outside your house. You don't go till your flower garden. And so the only for no-till, and this is truly dependent on who you talk to, there are die-hard no-tillers, which means no disturbance of the soil. Usually, in general, I would argue for no-till, you can break the soil surface when you're seeding, so when you're putting seeds in the ground, and when you do fertilization, knifing and fertilizer. But it's limited to that, and that's it. Otherwise, if you're going to go in through with what they call a ripper or a subsoiler to break up those hard pans, those implements are considered tillage. And what they do is they do minimal surface disturbance, but break up anywhere from 10 to 14 inches below the surface of the soil. And so they're breaking that apart. And so that gets into what we call conservation tillage, but the whole point with the inversion is to break up the ground underneath, but leaving that residue on the soil surface, leaving the surface as undisturbed as possible. Okay? In terms of adoption, about 63% of farmers in Kansas have adopted no tillage on at least one of their crops. And I'm going to come back to that. And so it is the dominant tillage in terms of, and that's true, depending where you're in the US, this is a little higher. In other areas. But we're at about 63%. Mostly, most corn and soybeans is raised using no-till. Okay? In terms of what are the benefits, and I'm an economist, so there's real-life benefits, and then there's, for me, which is more interesting, there's perceived benefits, because that's what people are acting on. As a social science, we study decision-making, and so we're interested in what people actually do, and they're going to act on the knowledge of what they perceive is the gain. And so we did survey work this past winter, and I'll talk more about it, of what the final results, but these are some of the summary statistics we came out with, and we did about 19 workshops across the state of Kansas over a 3-month period. And so we literally traveled to all corners of the state. And we were really interested in this kind of perceived yield effect. And are people who are using no-till, are they perceiving a benefit? And And so what was interesting was, for the most part, in the majority, for most crops, farmers are perceiving a benefit. The one exception where we see the least no-tillage actually is wheat. There's still resistance out there to adopting no-till wheat. People do believe you have to do what we call reduced tillage, which is using a disc and chisel before doing wheat, okay? And they have different reasons. I'm not going to go get into all those. We could spend the whole seminar just talking about that alone. But it's really interesting. But in terms of what we see is the most benefit, even if there was a benefit, 42% of the people aren't perceiving any from doing no-till. So, and a lot of these people are people who we talk to are people who do conservation. These are conservationists for farmers. In addition, we asked about what are some of the other benefits you see from no-till that you've actually experienced. And we tried to get this in terms of what are people seeing in terms of these benefits. In terms of, the red is lower, green is neutral kind of, and your blue is telling us higher benefits. And so as we'd expect, some surprising things came out. We expect that production costs usually go down with adopting no-tillage. That was kind of mixed. The one thing we highly expected is that soil erosion is lower. That's one of the reasons we adopt no-till, is to prevent water and wind erosion. We see improvements, and we expected improvements in soil fertility. So what we'd actually expected, and this is what they're actually experiencing, and lower weed pressures. So some of these are flipped around, but the red is good for weed pressure. If you want higher weed pressure, that means you're probably going to use more of those herbicides that end up in the Mississippi at some point, probably. Some of them, at least. What was interesting to us is most people have argued, the majority have argued they've seen higher net returns, they think, from adopting no-tillage. What was unexpected to us, and something we thought was, in general, we thought they would reduce their labor. By doing no-till, I don't have to take my machinery through the field. I'm not driving through the field 3 or 4 times a year. And so we would expect reduction in labor costs because I'm taking that operation out of my farming practice. And it would free up time. Interestingly enough, that was true for some of the people, but some people haven't experienced that. Part of it is because they've gone to more intense conservation systems, which does increase management intensity, but in a different way. So their labor is getting refocused. Another reason is because a lot of these farms have used that free labor to go rent more land and increase the size of their farm. And I've heard cases, we've actually met farmers where we've heard cases where farmers have literally been able to almost double the size of their farm after adopting no-till with the amount of time it's freed up from doing some of this stuff. So this is a big one. Labor went up, but by moving in this direction, these conservation systems, management intensity has also gone up. And so there's a lot more management intensity in terms of getting timing right, making sure you're doing things at the right time. What other practices we have? Probably one of the biggest ones that's being pushed right now, at least in the agricultural community, are cover crops. These are getting, at least over the last 5 years, and still are getting a lot of press. And so what is a cover crop? So cover crops are grasses, legumes, brassicas, or small grains that are grown between 2 actual cash crops. Cash crops are crops we harvest. And they're grown in the growing season between these 2, and they're primarily for a conservation purpose. So we're planting them to provide biomass or build soil fertility, okay? And so the whole idea is to improve our soil productivity through that residue or through providing that nitrogen, like from a legume, okay? And so this is kind of the cutting edge, one of the cutting edge conservation practices, especially I would say in the Midwest, because we're still learning how we need to adapt these to get them into our production systems and what works. And even sometimes when we find ones that work, they work in one area, you take them to another, they don't work, okay? And so there have been success cases, there have also been cases where people failed. And you can kind of notice we're still in that learning phase. Only 7% of the farmers in Kansas have used or adopted cover crops, okay? And so it's a really low rate. And this is in contrast to, say, the Southeast, where cover crops probably started in the United States, where adoption may be about 15–20%. Okay? And so, and it's kind of the culture. So all the stuff they're going over cover crops now in Kansas, I heard when I started work in Alabama. That was their big thing then. We heard the same stories, the same issues 12 years ago. And so it's interesting in terms of, as it moves, it's new here. In terms of what cover crops are we talking about? So legumes are stuff like cowpeas, winter peas, hairy vetch, crimson clover. One of the ones I like, but it's very variable, sun hemp. That's not the stuff you smoke. So you can't go buy it in Colorado. I don't think you'd want to. I think that would be a bad. But all these provide nitrogen. The whole idea of planting, the primary reason for planting a legume is to get nitrogen into the soil. Some of these do moderate amounts of nitrogen. Some, if you can get them to grow well, will produce a lot of nitrogen. So sun hemp has been shown to produce upwards of 100–120 pounds of nitrogen per acre. If you can get it to produce and get the biomass and get it to bloom. There's also cereal or grains such as rye, oats, millet, triticale. And so these are primarily grown for two reasons. One is biomass, to get coverage on the soil surface. So one of the big reasons, rye is a very popular cover crop in the Southeast. And the whole reason people grow it is to biomass. So in essence, you grow it over the winter. Before you plant in the spring, at the end of March, you kill it. And you leave it on the soil surface. It's not harvested. If you harvest the crop, we call it a cash crop. And you would manage it completely differently. We apply almost none or very little nitrogen to the rye crop. And if you want it to produce grain, you're going to apply a lot more nitrogen to it. And so it's managed for conservation purposes alone, to provide mulch on the soil surface to prevent erosion and increase organic matter over time. And so rye is a good option. Commonly in Kansas, I think I've seen more millet and wheat used from the cereal grains. Rye is a bad word in Kansas in some parts. And so some people consider it, I've heard of invasive species. But rye is a very good, one of the things about, there's a form of oats called black oats. One of the really good things about rye and black oats that have also been shown to be true is that they have what we call allelopathic properties. And basically what that is they leach their own chemicals that they produce themselves that act as natural herbicides. So they fight weeds. So they're fighting to protect themselves. And so they have these abilities. They have a very good ability to suppress weeds. So that not only from the chemicals, but when they're growing. And so you get some very good weed control with these cover crops. And then there's grasses like sorghum, Sudan grass. Again, you're growing them for biomass. This can get pretty big. And then the one I didn't list here, brassicas. This is like turnips, white radish, like right here. A lot of these are grown for performing what we call natural tillage. So instead of doing non-inversion, people will grow radishes. White radish will grow about 12 to 14 inches long. They're pretty big long tubers. And then pretty much, and in the right situation, they winter kill. So we can't grow them in the Southeast. They're really hard to kill with herbicides. And they grow back if you don't kill them. Then they become a volunteer weed. But in the right spots, they'll winter kill naturally. So you don't actually have to terminate them. They produce a lot of biomass, and they produce a lot of tubers. And so you get a lot of this natural tillage from them in the right environments. And so that's another reason we do brassicas. So we can get that tillage without actually using an implement. Variable cost, one of the biggest things with cover crops is the cost range, depending on what kind of cover you use, anywhere from $40 to $100 an acre. And considering a cash crop's going to run you $400 to $600 to grow, that's a decent amount of expense to consider adding on top of that and growing. So the economics behind cover crops is still a significant issue. In terms of the perceived yield gains from cover crops by farmers who've used them, kind of mixed. I don't know that we have any significant amount. People who have used them and have been successful with them said, yeah, in the first year I didn't necessarily make a gain, but they feel over time that they have benefited their cropping systems, and they have seen the gains later on. And then there's a lot of mixed review in terms of people who've tried them and they didn't work out, or people who are considering them. They just don't know. So there's a lot of green here on just uncertainty. And so we're still in the learning phase in terms of trying to figure this out. Another practice is what we call conservation crop rotations. And so this is from NRCS. It's something we looked at because we were trying to find a crop rotation practice. There are a ton that have been suggested in the agronomic literature. We were trying to look for something in the area of dynamic crop rotations. So we just went with NRCS's kind of conservation practice, conservation crop rotation. And this one's actually a little bit more intense than people usually realize. So you have to plant 3 crops in 3 years. One of those crops has to be a high residue crop, like corn. And one of those crops has to be a legume, like soybeans. And then you have to pick another crop in rotation. So you have to have 3 crops in 3 years and meet those 2 minimum requirements. The other option is you can go with a grass in one of those years. That's also an option. That gets into a conservation system we call sod-based rotations. And those are a little bit different. But these are options for conservation rotations. And the whole point is to start intensifying the rotation, bringing in more species and more different varieties of crops. And the big benefits there is breaking those disease and pest cycles. In terms of conservation crop rotation, not really surprisingly, but it was a little surprising to us of how many people are actually doing this already, have just switched to this naturally. This is not something that gets paid a lot out. A lot of farmers have switched to crop rotations, and a lot are moving and adapting and getting into, so we have the adoption level of the amount of rotation and the amount of land. This is a sample of farms in Kansas, but it's the bigger farmers that are switching to this, adopting these conservation cropping rotations. So they're moving to planting 3 crops. And the diversity really helps, especially if you have a bad crop year. And it's pretty much all crops are being rotated. We didn't find one crop just being excluded. In terms of another one, crop nutrient management. So crop nutrient management is a whole skew of practices. One that we've looked at is use of manure. I kind of put this one on the fence as a conservation practice, depending on how you manage it. I consider it a conservation practice in the sense that if you raise livestock, use of manure is a nice way to dispose of that and keep it in the system. You can apply it to pasture, to crops. Given that Kansas is the 2nd largest beef producing state in the United States, only 9% of farmers use manure as an organic fertilizer source. Not as wide as I think we'd expect on their farms, but people are using the manure. And I think one of the limitations is how much manure can I put on my field without over-applying. And a big one is nitrogen and phosphorus limits. And then finally another one, again this one's kind of on the fence but has been viewed as a conservation practice, is precision agriculture. Variable rate application of inputs. The idea behind variable rate application is applying the inputs you need in the amounts you need where you need it. So I'm not over applying fertilizer in a place that doesn't need the fertilizer, because usually the practice is a uniform rate across the field. But in reality, the amount I need in the field differs spatially across the field. It's not the same. And so if I over-apply to one area, what's going to happen to the excess nitrogen? Well, it's got to go somewhere. And the soil can only hold so much. And so the rest of it's going to either run off or leach off. Okay? And in terms of variable rate, the most common forms of variable rate, at least in Kansas, are application of nitrogen or different types of fertilizer and application of lime. There are technologies to do, and a lot of these are based on what we call map-based technologies. People actually do what we call grid-based soil sampling, so they do really intense soil sampling within their field, find the variability within their field, possibly map it to yields, and then figure out they have a consultant usually help figure out what their application rates should be, and then they apply those rates to their fields. So it's all based on data we're collecting from maps. And there's other data sources we can bring in as well. Another one is sensor-based technologies. These aren't used as often, and I haven't seen them used a lot commercially. Probably the most familiar commercial application would be herbicides. They do have a hooded sprayer that has sensors in the sprayer that actually detects green. And it actually detects the intensity of green in an area as it passes over the field, and it sprays herbicide based on that intensity. So it's actually on-the-go sprayer. So it doesn't detect weeds, and so it's hooded, so it's not spraying your crops. It's spraying in between the crops. And so it actually adjusts on the fly. And so that's kind of, it's been around, and that technology's been around for about a decade, 15 years. I have not seen it, it's available commercially, but I haven't seen it really used. And so that's kind of, there is sensor-based technologies that are coming into use. And then there's a whole area of variable rate, like bringing in all about the information that you need to do this, which I'm not getting into. I'm more interested in just the use of it. And the whole point of the conservation practices is we're not over-applying inputs. And so that would be the benefit. In terms of variable rate application of inputs in Kansas, it's really variable. And a lot of variable rate application is done custom, meaning someone else does it, not the farmer themselves, because the farmers don't own the equipment. And so it's really dependent upon the availability of services. And this has been really kind of fluctuating, because people have had services and we hear they lose them. And then they get them back. A cooperative picks it up, or a farmer decides to start doing it. And so it depends on the availability of services. And so that's why these numbers tend to be in flux. And so it's not as widely adopted yet as potentially it could be. So those are some of the practices that can go into a conservation system. And so the question comes down to, at least from an economic or social point of view, the question comes down to, what, if I'm going to make the decision, I'm a crop producer, what am I going to do, or what are the things that I take into mind when making that decision to adopt a conservation practice or alter my crop production system to bring in conservation practices? Okay? And so there's a lot of potential benefits that we take into account. And so we need to weigh as an economist, I tell you weigh the benefits and costs. And so potentially, hopefully we get improved profitability. Bottom line does matter. It might not be our only objective. We might want to protect the environment. But I can tell you, a farmer's not going to adopt it if they're losing money consistently, okay? Or if it's costing them a lot of money. And so we want to improve profitability. That can come from higher yields, lower production costs, lower risk, improved sustainability, better management, and just use of less inputs overall. And a lot of farmers, I think, I would argue in general in the agriculture, the environmental stewardship is a common value. It's viewed differently. So where you sit on that spectrum differs. People are at one end and the other. There are people that don't care, and then there's people that are at the far spectrum, do everything we can to protect the environment. And so the agricultural community in general is interested in the environmental benefits. We know the value of soil. It's what we need to grow crops. And so lesser soil erosion is a good thing. Protecting water quality, improved soil health and productivity, and then potentially improved wildlife habitats and rural landscapes. And this is becoming more important as we see farmers starting to invest in like hunting land or wildlife areas, wildlife habitat. And so from that perspective, it's becoming of interest to start protecting those areas and making them more natural. But there's costs. You'll have an increase in both direct and indirect costs. It could be while we have higher crop yields, it could be at some point we have lower crop yields from adopting a practice or revenues. Like cover crops, we tend to have an increase in production costs. Even though we might have some savings, they're not enough to offset the increase in costs. Higher human capital requirements, especially with like precision agriculture, with the increased technology. More intense crop management. And time management becomes increasingly crucial the more conservation-oriented you get. And then there's potentially environmental costs. Precision agriculture and I'll show you a slide here soon, may not actually reduce the amount of nitrogen you're applying to your field. And at the end of the day, you might have a prescription map that tells you apply more than you've been applying. You haven't been putting enough on the field. And some people don't like that conclusion. And so all this boils down to, is this going to increase or decrease my profit or help or hurt the environment? And we got to weigh that decision if I should adopt or not. Okay? And it's all these characteristics that come into play. So it's not a simple dollar and cents either. So what are some of the actual evidence that's out there? And so this is just a snapshot of different places. So here's some of the benefits. People have shown some benefits of adopting conservation tillage or no-tillage systems from corn and soybean rotations. So there's evidence where people have shown it's profitable. I would say more recent evidence shows we're getting better at managing it. We've seen more profitability from no-till production versus in the past. It's been a mixed message. Does it increase or not? One of the things that we've seen in the past is yields haven't been as high under a no-till system, but the amount of cost savings you get from reducing your inputs had actually made up for that loss in yield, and people still made more money. So it was still worth adopting it. In cotton production, we've seen some significant benefits of moving to conservation tillage systems. And cotton is pretty much grown across this belt in the United States. We have a little bit of cotton in Kansas, southern Kansas. In terms of the economic benefits of cover crops, considering this cover crops, you have to consider a lot of different things. In terms of cover crops, you have to look at the crop rotation. So one of the big choices in cover crops is, okay, I want to do a cover crop, then it's which cover crop? There's lots of varieties. And people even do what they call mixtures. They mix varieties when they plant them, like up to 7 different varieties of plants at the same time. And there's benefits to those mixtures in some places and not in others. And so you have to weigh these benefits of soil productivity, potentially yield gains, and the additional nitrogen, those are probably the 2 big ones, against the costs. You have those establishment costs, management intensity, and potentially foregone opportunities. If you're grazing your cattle in the winter and you plant a cover crop, you may be able to graze part of the cover, but to get the conservation benefit, you can't have those cattle graze it to the soil surface. And so you want to make sure, give that cover crop a chance to grow back a bit to get the benefits out of it. And so there's that conservation side of it. Otherwise, it just becomes a forage. And so there's that opportunity cost of foregoing that additional grazing time there. And potentially there's equipment costs for adopting conservation practices, for managing. And so you have to consider, and not only that, then when you're making these decisions, you have to weigh the economic factors. So there's potentially higher end prices, or with higher end prices, cover crops become especially more economically viable, especially a legume. They become an alternative source. And management, this is something that I don't think gets pushed enough. Probably a lot of people argue water is the limiting factor in agriculture. As a social scientist, I say the other big limiting factor is management. And it's not only just, do you have the knowledge and the ability to actually successfully apply these practices? Because there's people that can apply them that will fail. And it's because they don't have the ability to do so. Or they're not trained properly to do so, even though they could be successful. And so, even though someone tells us it didn't work for me, it doesn't mean that we couldn't get to work for him. And so that's something that we have to take into account, is that management ability. And that human capital is big, and it's something we don't stress enough. And it plays a key role in making this stuff successful. So what about the benefits of cover crops? And this is really where it gets mixed. So this is data from an actual cover crop experiment in Heston, Kansas, out by Wichita. And this was, they actually rotated a cover crop prior to sorghum in a sorghum wheat rotation. And you don't have to look at all the numbers. Just look at the bottom one. This was the economic return. So the base practice was no cover crop. And then when we added a soybean cover, we looked at a soybean and a sun hemp cover crop. The soybean cover crop at the end lost $19 an acre, and the sun hemp cover crop lost $11 an acre. And really the big thing that the sun hemp cover crops lost money at the end of the day because of the cost of the seed of the cover. So sun hemp cover crops are $2 and about $2 to $2.50 a pound for sun hemp. And usually they're applying like 10 pounds. And I've heard people applying up to 30 pounds. And so depending on what you're applying, you can get a big cost. That seed cost alone, without putting it into the ground, without managing or killing it, that's anywhere from $25 to $75 in seed costs per acre. That's a lot of money if you're putting that on, say, 500 acres. Okay, you're looking at about $35,000. And so it's that cost that's really determining that. And so a farmer may be willing to take that $11 loss if they think they were going to get longer-term benefits out of it, because this is a short-term analysis. Or if they feel that a loss is worth protecting the environment and the nitrogen and stuff they're getting out of it. And so just because it is a loss doesn't mean that might not be significant enough for someone to say no, but it is something that we take into account. At the end of the day, a lot of people see this and go, yeah, I don't know. I don't know if I want to spend more money than I'm going to get out.
Did they track changes in nitrogen then input with that particular? I mean, did people see the benefit when you talked about?
So they didn't adjust. So we had variable rate nitrogen. So we did, this is taking into account the optimal. So we calculated the optimal N rates.
Okay.
And so we did reduce N. So on the no-cover system, the optimal N rate was 105, and it was 72 under the sun hemp.
Okay.
So ideal. So, and that's one of the other big things, especially with legume cover crops, is people will plant these crops, and they tend to use the nitrogen as an insurance policy instead of actually what we call crediting the nitrogen, so lowering their actual commercial fertilizer rates to take account of the nitrogen that's in the ground. And so what happens possibly is you end up over-applying. So if the rate you should be applying is 105, and this sun hemp is dumping 40 pounds of N into the ground, but you apply 105, which is all that's needed by the plant, then you're over applying about 70 pounds. And so where does that nitrogen go? The soil can hold some of it, but if you do that year after year, this is what some people we try to educate farmers now who are getting into legume cover crops of saying, if you do it year after year, you should be adjusting your fertilization rates. Because if you don't, you might have as big a worse nitrogen problem than the farmers applying commercial fertilizer next door. And it's something to think about. So even conservation systems, while good, can lead to bad as well if they're not managed properly. This was something we worked on back in Alabama in terms of the cover crop benefits and the biomass. And so what this graph shows is this is a rye cover crop. And so this is the amount of biomass. And this is number of pounds left on the soil surface. So this is up to 5,000. And then what we have here is returns in dollars per acre. Okay? The red curve here shows just the cost of the cover crop. And so our cost was $55, and we had $8 and about $7.50, $8 in herbicide savings from it. We actually sprayed one less time. And so our total cost, about $48. And so the idea here is this is just a constant amount. This is the actual revenue I'm earning off the crop, the marginal gain, as the amount of residue on the soil surface goes up. And so the point of this is that residue is keeping soil moisture in the soil and improving soil productivity and preventing erosion. Okay? What we're trying to find is there actually a productivity benefit from this. And we're in an experiment where we could actually do this because we had varying amounts of residue. And so what we found was it took quite a bit to get that curve to go up. And so right about 6,000 is where we stopped. We think it plateaus at some point. But what was interesting here was the intersection of these two curves where it costs. So this is the point at which this intersection is the point at which I'm covering my cover crop costs. So in this case, the optimal level of biomass is about 5,000 pounds. And so managing my rye cover crop to get me that, which is about chest height, was enough to get me the benefits, cover my cost, and give me enough yield gain. Okay? And it doesn't take huge yield gains to do that. And so it's profitable beyond this point. And so we had places where we grew rye cover crops, where we actually, it was interesting enough, after like 5 years, we stopped growing them because we had a mulch layer about 1 inch to 2 inches thick that was permanent. The crop residues themselves kept adding to it every year, and it replenished itself. We actually got to stop planting covers because we never saw the soil surface after that. And so in some instances, that's why we're thinking there's a plateau at some point for the amount of residue you want. But this was just one of the benefits. We were trying to see, is there a benefit from the residue itself? And so we did see some benefit. In terms of variable rate application of inputs, this is where it really varies a lot. So we have corn. And the one thing I want to point here is, remember I mentioned that varies in the field how much you're going to apply. So this varies a lot. Nitrogen applied in these different for these different crops. This is an experiment in Texas, and this is what they ranged from. So for cotton, it ranged, they dropped it by 43% in parts of the field, but increased it up to 58% over the regular application rate in other parts of the field. Notice for corn, it went up 70 to 191%. They weren't applying enough. And so with variable rate, you have to really take into consideration the conservation benefit is really dependent upon the management and the information you're using to determine how much to apply. But you can apply a lot more than we're applying currently. The idea behind this is to get it where you need it, so the crop's using it, instead of having it run off. So one of the questions that comes back, and one of the ones we're particularly interested in, especially with no-till, one of the things with adopting new technologies is risk. It's just a risk to take on a new technology because I have to learn about it. There's potential lower yields and other problems and changes into my system. And so one of the things I have to look at is, or take into consideration, is that risk. And what we're interested in was, do you feel these practices, we're actually interested in the opposite. Since some of these practices are becoming the norm, are they still considered risky? And so this is something that hasn't been strongly documented yet. But one of the things we found, and we had another study, we kind of found evidence of this, especially for no-till. So I still think farmers think cover crops are risky and potentially variable rate application. But interestingly enough, crop rotations and no-till are actually considered risk-reducing inputs, meaning adopting these actually reduces your risk on the farm. And there's evidence to show that adoption of no-till actually reduces crop yield variability over time. And so you actually get, it may not give you the high highs that conventional systems do, but you never get the low lows either. And so in times of drought, these systems do a lot better. So there's many factors that come into adoption. And we've talked a lot about these, the economic and the environmental factors. And so what are some of these more socioeconomic factors that we look at in economics? So we looked at farms, a lot of different factors. Farm size, what crops do you grow, demographics such as race, gender, age, your education level and farm experience. What are your perceptions and beliefs? Culture, that's a big one. Your environmental attitudes. Are you willing to learn? How much are you actually willing to pay to adopt a new technology? Are there federal programs that'll pay me to do this? We always like that. And if I get into those programs, what are the requirements? And then what is the makeup of my farm? What are my enterprises? A predominant livestock operation that grows feed for their cattle may not be as interested in conservation as a farmer who grows crops as their primary income source. And so you have to weigh all that. And so what have we found this was a survey we did in Kansas where we surveyed 10,000 farmers. We had about 24% respond back, taking account all the bad ones out, bad addresses, and so forth. And here's kind of the big picture takeaway. We found no tillage was adopted by farmers on land that is highly erodible, and so where we would expect it. Surprisingly, in areas with less rainfall, and that's primarily that soil water benefit, and by farmers with more experience. Cover crops, people who did adopt them are people who are involved in conservation programs such as EQIP and CSP. That's the Environmental Quality Incentives Program. CSP is the Conservation Stewardship Program. They're both run by USDA, Natural Resource Conservation Service. A lot of these people had college experience. which is actually a significant thing in Kansas compared to when I was in the Southeast. About 40% of farmers in Kansas have a college degree. Average age of farmers is now 58. And these were adopted in wetter environments. So mostly you're seeing them in eastern and central Kansas. The use of manure was adopted by farmers primarily who are enrolled in EQIP and CSP, and people who raised livestock. Got to put the poop somewhere. So, and so a lot of different factors affect practice adoption. And these are factors that policymakers are interested in because they help tailor programs to, and attract farmers to get these practices on the ground. So what does it take to intensify conservation on farm and in Kansas? And I'll try to go through this quickly since I spent a long time at the beginning. And so what we did is we held a lot of workshops around Kansas. In 12 locations, we had 19 workshops. We talked to 248 farmers. We asked them 4 hours worth of questions and discussion. And so we talked to a lot of people. We have tons of information. And so our average farmer was 58 years old, farmed about 2,500 acres, and had about, what do I want to say, 6.2. They fall within the same about here. They fall within about $500,000, $400,000, $500,000 of sales per year. And so what we did is we did an exercise experiment with them asking, what would it take to get you to actually intensify conservation? That means not just doing no-till on one crop, but doing it on every crop year after year. Adopting a cover crop, actually doing variable rate applications if you're not doing it, or doing more, and adopting a conservation crop rotation. And the primary vehicle to do this, at least from an economic point of view that's being used now, are contracts. And so we looked at contracts to do this. So our contracts specified what practices you had to adopt. We looked at 4, the ones I just mentioned. And then for doing so, they would be provided an incentive from $5 to $75 per year. That was randomly varied. And then we had 2 incentive programs. You can go under the traditional program. We offered a private program called the carbon market. And this one was really interesting to talk to them about because most of the carbon markets no longer exist or are temporarily shut down. And then we asked them about often, there should be pictures here. Here they are. And asked them how important is off-farm environmental benefits. So we actually gave them a measure of medium, high, or low of the off-farm environmental impact. And then we had a question asking them about risk, changes in net farm income. So how would my net income, my bottom line, this goes to the immediate bottom line, the income I earn, how would that change if I adopted this contract? And so they got asked a series of 12 questions that look like this. And so this is all statistically done and designed. Surprisingly, we can go to 24, I think we set it up so we have 24 people and not one person would get the same question. So we had 288 different scenarios we could hand out based on what we did. And then, so we have people, randomly we hand these out and people go through them. And we basically ask them, would you adopt this contract or would you stay with what you're currently doing? And what this allows us to do is get their preferences on differences related to conservation and the environment and the options within this contract. So what did we find? Well, obviously the level of net farm income is important. I would hope, and so that was highly significant. Surprisingly, and we didn't know what to expect here, farmers care about off-farm environmental impacts. What we found is that farmers, the higher the off-farm environmental impact, the more likely they are to adopt. And there was a preference for federal programs because of the uncertainties in the market-based programs that currently exist. These are the probability curves we actually estimated from this experiment. And so this is the probability of actually adopting a contract. And what we have is the top curve is one practice, no-till. Then you go to no-till plus a cover crop. Then add a crop rotation, and then do all 4. And so as you notice, as you'd expect, when you keep adding them, the probability of adoption goes down. So this is adopting the most intense, and this is the least intense. But what's interesting was the reason we like these curves is this gives us some idea of what would it take to get people to actually adopt. And at what incentive levels? So this is the actual incentive. So as the incentive goes up, adoption increases. And it doesn't quite ever hit 100% here, but $75 an acre, which is a pretty good payment. That's about the top end of you could get now if you did everything possible. And so we can get to 70, 80% adoption over time. I'll preface that. And so a larger incentive is needed to induce the adoption of cover crops, especially, and variable rate, compared to continuous no-till and conservation crop rotations. And the main factors limiting the adoption of entering into a conservation contract were restrictiveness. Some farmers don't like the fact that they have to enter a contract for a period of time. A big one that came back in comments is production costs. And we found 62% of the farmers would only adopt conservation practices if it resulted in higher net returns. So that net returns becomes a huge issue for us. And something we're looking more into now is that risk factor. We're doing a lot with the modeling on that side of it. And this is kind of what we do in economics. So some biologists, environmentalists do not like this. We try to put values on things. So as economists, we don't say these are the values of them, but we try to put values on environmental amenities and stuff. So what is water quality worth? What is environmental protection worth? And so this is kind of moving in that direction. But what this is if a farmer did enter into a contract, how much would I have to pay them to have these different options? And so what's interesting is, notice for the practices that are least adopted, like cover crops and variable rate, I have to pay them an additional $16 per acre on average to get them to sign a contract with those practices in it. What we found really interesting was here, the low and medium. Notice a contract that only doesn't have high off-site, these are off-site benefits, so these are environmental benefits off your farm. So this is like water quality, sedimentation and stuff. And so the nice thing here is the medium, if you only provide medium benefits, not high, I need to pay you an additional $7. And if there's low impact, meaning not much off-farm impact, we have to pay you $10 additional. And that was big for us. And these are significant statistically. And so that was a big thing for us, because one of the things that's argued is, and a lot of people say farmers don't care. And they do care about the off-site environmental impacts. They're worried about their farm. They care what's happening to their neighbors and their communities as well. And then this was the effect, is if you wanted to have a market-based program, which is not completely ran by the government, then you got to pay them a little extra. They like the federal programs. They know how they run. They're very familiar with them. And they're usually a sure thing. So far, the federal government has paid their payouts. So we haven't run into a situation where we've defaulted yet. And so this is just a quote. One thing I usually end this is this picture. And if you ever want to imagine what are the impacts of soil erosion, there's a canyon in Georgia called Providence Canyon. It's right outside Columbus, Georgia. I know the last time I went, I think the deepest spot is 204 feet. So this canyon used to be a small mountain. They actually have pictures of it back in the early 1850s, I think, 1860s, whenever the photography first started. But maybe it's a little later. But they actually have pictures of this area before. And over the last 150 years, it's eroded anywhere from 1 inch to 2 inches a year. And so the deepest spots run about 200, so this is a 200-foot deep gully now that used to be a mountain. In 150 years, this canyon formed. So it is possible. And if you don't believe the canyon, you can just drive the roadside ditches that are like 30, 35 feet deep. And these are just rain gullies from the rain. And people started to do ag here. And believe me, they stopped real quick, because literally there's accounts of just crops washing away. They plant their crops, they pop out of the ground, bad rainfall comes, and the whole field just washes off because they disturbed the soil. That's all it took. And they've been trying everything for the past, and NRCS has been trying all the way through the 1900s to stop it. And so there's old beat up cars, they've planted trees, and they have not been successful. But soil erosion can be a real thing. And so this is an interesting one. But one of the big things is conservation matters. And I figure that's probably a running theme in your guys' class. But from a farming perspective, it matters too. And the one thing that I would say as a takeaway message is, when you're thinking about conservation and the environment, at least from a social perspective. And I'm dealing with this a little bit when I deal with natural scientists that are very ingrained in their discipline, is from a human perspective, if you want the environmental change to be effective on the ground, you have to take into consideration the social, economic, and cultural context. Because people aren't going to come in, if you don't take the cultural context into account and the differences in beliefs, policy just isn't going to happen, or you're going to get backlash. So the outcomes can actually be worse. So that's kind of my takeaway. So.
Thank you very